Okay, so this is the second session of our three-part series. So you want to present at a Tolkien conference, and this one specifically will focus on the paper and the presentation. So how to take this proposal that you've now gotten accepted and turn it into a a paper and then a presentation on the based off of that. So first, to start off, writing the paper. So, right, probably everyone here, I think I know everyone here well enough to know that you've probably written research papers before. Although I will put an asterisk there that I teach writing among the many and odd things that I teach my young adolescent students. Writing is one of them. So if I can squeeze words out of a 13-year-old, then I can help absolutely anybody with writing at this point. So if there is something that you're like, wow, she really glossed over that, and I don't actually know how to do that, please feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to help with any of that. But as a general rule, I'm going to assume that most people have probably written a nonfiction or a research paper before. And I'm going to talk about specifically how to write one for a presentation because it is different writing for a presentation than writing for like a class or even a journal or other publication. It's certainly different than writing for Tumblr or some of the formats that we all are most or are more familiar with. So to start out with, you're going to structure your paper in an hourglass shape, by which I mean that we start really broad in terms of topic, narrow it down, and then broaden it out again. So here's the breakdown of that. So starting with the introduction, so again, really, really broad. Like, what is my topic? What am I talking about today? I'm talking about death scenes on the Quintus Silmarillion, say. Then you start to get narrower and narrower with your literature review, your methodology, and then you're really focused. And this is where the bulk of your paper is. And I'll talk about timing a lot more. I'm tired of hearing me say the word time. Um, is going to be in your evidence, results, and analysis. That's going to be the really focused part. And then you broaden it back out again in your conclusion to how this applies to Tolkien studies more generally. So that's generally the structure of it. I want to pay respect to everybody's method of writing. I'm going to talk about what has worked for me. So I've done 19 as of last weekend, Tolkien and fan studies conferences. So this is what I have discovered works for me when I'm writing something that will become a presentation. Because again, you're thinking in terms of time, not in terms of page or word count, which is usually what you're thinking about if you're writing for a print publication. Or you might not be thinking about it at all if you're writing for a site like Tumblr or the SWG. You're just holding forth for as long or as short as you want. When you're writing for a presentation, of course, you're writing in terms of how long it will take to actually present it. And that does mean approaching it a little bit differently. So, talking about my own method for how I find works for that. And again, please throw this out if this is not any sort of golden rule. None of this is. As I tell my students, the number one rule of writing is that there are no rules of writing. So I always start in the middle of the hourglass. And going back there, that's going to be the evidence, results, and analysis section. That's where I always begin in my writing. And the reason I do that is because, one, I'm writing for time constraints. So I want to make sure that I'm actually paying attention or giving enough time to my work and not to the things that surround it. Once I have that core written, it's a lot easier for me to see the background that my audience needs so that I'm really focused there and I'm not spending time, there's that word again, on things that my audience doesn't necessarily need. Same with literature. My literature review then is more focused on what literature actually forms the foundation for my ideas versus just kind of a literature dump, which can take up, here's that word again, time that I don't have. And then it makes my conclusion a little bit more easy to write, which conclusions are the hardest thing for me personally to write because it makes me think more, it makes me more aware of how my work builds on or challenges existing work and new directions that I may be going in. So starting in the middle, like I said, ensures that I'm focused on my work and not the things that surround it. So that's the literature review, the methodology, the introduction, all of that stuff that can actually be really, really fun to write and really, really fun to present about. But when you're working within time constraints, can sometimes need to be shortened. So you want to make sure you're focused there. I also want to put out there that it is okay if when you're writing, especially when you start in the middle, you'll really quickly start to realize how well you targeted your proposal. And it is okay if you deviate from your proposal. No one is checking your work. The conference organizer is not sitting there with a, red pen and your proposal and checking off all of the things that you said were going to be in there. The conference organizer is probably way too busy and frontal to even consider doing that. So it is okay to write more if you're finding that your proposal didn't quite cover everything that you need to. In most cases, you're going to end up writing less. So it's okay to cut from what you said you were going to talk about in your proposal. So please don't feel married to that proposal. Don't structure to fit the proposal if the presentation suffers for it. So if you need more or less time, feel free to do that. Okay, so time. Like I said, this is the this is the session where that is going to be the four-letter word, the most important word, but also the one that you're going to want to never hear me say again at the end of it. So you're writing for not a word count, not a page count, like is normal when we write for print publication. You're writing to fit a time block. So you should always be aware of how much time you have to start off with. Meritha Derathat is 15 minutes. Most Tolkien conferences are right around 20 minutes, but it can vary. I've had as long as 50 minutes, which feels so luxurious. 15 and 20 minutes is really short. It doesn't seem like it, especially if you don't like public speaking or you're not fully comfortable with that. Maybe like, oh my goodness, I'm going to be up there forever. How am I going to stand up there for 20 minutes? It is really short when you're actually writing a paper. And Meritha Derathat is 15, so it's even shorter. So I recommend knowing how fast you read. So getting a reading rate ahead of time. So I just, set my phone for a minute, stopwatch, and read off of a text for 1 minute and then see how many words I've read. That's how I got it for myself. And then you can calculate like roughly what your word count will be. Because as writers, we're usually more comfortable writing for word count than for time. Um, and then plan each section with a word count in mind. Again, and I'm going to get into this more as I talk about the sections, so that you're focusing on your work and not the things that are around it that really don't need that level of attention. So some cautionary tales around time. So first of all, at conferences, do not assume you will be able to take extra time. I don't think I have ever been to a conference in any area, whether my profession as an educator or my hobby as a independent scholar in Tolkien studies and fan studies, that is ahead of schedule. If anything, they're going to be running behind schedule, and the organizer and moderators are going to be desperate to make up that time. So going over time, sadly and unfortunately, I've seen it happen, can mean that that time then later gets taken from presenters who are further downstream. None of us want to be that presenter who goes 5 minutes over time and then, somebody doesn't get a Q&A, for example, because of it, which I've definitely seen happen. And no one wants to be that person who's like, oh, if I hadn't have run over time, then this person would have gotten there full time. There are moderators. Moderators will vary in their aggressiveness and in monitoring the time. They will usually give some kind of signal when you're at like 5 minutes or 2 minutes and you need to be wrapping up. But some moderators will let you go a little bit over. Other moderators will cut you off at exactly that time. And that is like, again, nothing anyone wants to experience, especially as a first-time presenter where you have all of these amazing things you want to say and you don't get to say them because you got cut off. So timing yourself ahead of time, knowing you're coming in under time on a couple of tries before you go to actually present, is really important to do because some moderators will cut you off. And then something I have seen happen a lot in terms of time is that presenters get lost in the intro and the background information. They get lost in telling fun stories, or they get lost in presenting a really elaborate literature review. And 15 minutes of their 20 minutes, just hypothetically speaking, is given over to that. And then they find they're rushing through and maybe don't even get all the way through their own work. So again, structuring each section, like I'm going to spend 1 minute on my introduction, 1 minute on my literature review, and figuring out how many words that is, may seem really regimented, but it can ensure that the presentation is balanced where it needs to be balanced and that you're not going over time. Okay, so now talking about each part of the paper. So the introduction. So here you want to think about, and again, if you've written the middle section first, I'm going to go in the order of the paper, but this is not how I actually write. I write, like I said, that middle section. So evidence, results, and analysis, I write first. Then I write my introduction after that. Because at this point, I know what my audience needs to know. It can be a little tricky puzzling that out. So here's just some tips that I would give. So first of all, at a Tolkien conference, you can assume knowledge of Tolkien's major works. That would be The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, and Silmarillion. So you don't need to spend time rehashing basic plot and character. That's not a good use of your time presenting because most people who are attending a Tolkien conference are going to know that. What you should not assume people know is if you're tying in your own field. So a lot of us do this, right? We're none of us are professional Tolkien studies scholars. So we all work or do things that are, outside of Tolkien studies, and it can be really fun and a pretty easy way to bring in to come up with a really cool topic for a Tolkien conference to bring in your professional work or other areas of interest and apply them to Tolkien studies. So you can't assume that your audience is going to know terminology from your own discipline. So you should definitely define those things, even if they seem really basic um, to you as a professional in that area or a hobbyist in that area. And same thing with theoretical approaches. So people, for example, who work in literature or fan studies, um, anything, the sciences. If you're applying a theory, make sure that you're defining what that theory is. And then any works that come from anything other than the major texts, so History of Middle Earth, Unfinished Tales, Nature of Middle Earth, any of those posthumous texts other than the Silmarillion, really do not assume that people know anything about those at all. And that can feel, I know I have a lot of Silmarillion fan works people here. We're much more conversant in those works than the average Tolkien fan is. So anything that's really coming from those are characters that are specific to them, storylines that are specific to them, what texts are in them. So, for example, the Shibboleth of Feanor is probably familiar to every Tolkien fan fiction writer who's been in the fandom for more than a year. It's not going to be familiar to an audience at a general Tolkien conference. So you need to explain what that thing is. So that is worth taking the time to do. If you happen to be presenting at a conference on Tolkien, but the conference itself is not a Tolkien conference. So I have presented on Tolkien, for example, at the Popular Culture Association. So it is a much broader conference than something like Tolkien at UVM or um, Oxenmoot, where it is a Tolkien conference. Then you do need to provide some basic plot synopsis because you're going to have people in your audience who maybe have not read all of the books or read them so long ago that they don't necessarily remember what was in it. So then you do want to provide some plot synopsis. Okay, your literature review. You absolutely should acknowledge any scholars whose work you are building on. So, for example, to use just the recent example of one that I presented, my Silmarillion death scenes presentation, I was building on the work of Amant Radouche. So I absolutely needed to mention her in as somebody whose work I was building on. However, the purpose of your literature review is not to prove that you've done your homework. And this is where I see a lot of, especially first time or newer presenters get themselves into trouble because they want to go through, they've read 25 articles and books about this subject now, and they're really excited to share that with the audience. But that's not why the audience is there. So your literature review should be brief, especially if you're under 30 minutes for your presentation time, which is pretty much every Tolkien conference I have ever been to, with the exception of the New York Tolkien Conference, which no longer runs, has been 30 minutes or less. Then your literature review needs to be super brief. So what I can really emphasize here is to remember that people are here to hear your ideas. And if you are new as a presenter, you're a new scholar, you're a first time or new presenter, this can be really hard to wrap your brain around. And it can be really hard to almost accept because it's so tempting to want to be like, I am standing on the shoulders of giants. I am pointing out the giants who I am standing on. And be letting that kind of take up a lot of the presentation. But people are really and truly there to hear about your ideas. it can help to think that anyone there can read Verlin Flieger, they can read Dmitri Fimi, they can read all of these amazing scholars that came before us from a comfortable chair in their own home with a drink beverage of their choice rather than sitting in a cold, drafty lecture hall in an uncomfortable chair. So they are there making those sacrifices to hear from you. So make sure your work is centered. Methodology. So just to review, methodology is like how you know, um, how you drew your conclusions. It can be really brief. In a lot of cases, it will be. It will be just something like, I looked at the Silmarillion. So I'm not pulling from Lord of the Rings. I'm not pulling from The Hobbit. I'm not pulling from History of Middle-earth. I'm just using the Silmarillion. That could be a methodology. It can also, in the case of a lot of the work that I do, where I'm doing statistical analyses, I'm doing text analysis, I'm doing survey work. It can be much more involved. But again, time. You want to you want to keep this as brief as you can be. So you really need to think about what the audience needs to know versus what is nice to know. And if you have any methodology wonks out there, people who want to get in the weeds with you about, if you have a more complex methodology, and people who want to talk about statistical analysis or they want to talk about how you chose, your sample population or things like that. And again, most Tolkien studies papers are not going to even remotely get close to that. But if yours does, and people want to talk about that, that's what the Q&A is for. And so that can be the time where if your audience has interest in those topics, then they can they can ask during the Q&A, or if you provide your contact information at the end, then they can reach out and you guys can have a long and complicated discussion about the statistical methods that you used without taking up time on something the majority of people don't really need to know. Okay, evidence and analysis. This should be the bulk of your presentation, and ironically, it's the part I'm going to spend the least amount of time on because it's going to look so different for every person what you're including. If you're doing, like some of the mathematical, quantitative humanities stuff that I do, text analysis and whatnot, versus the more traditional, I'm reading the text and I'm providing evidence from Tolkien's works that support a particular idea. That's much more what this section looks like. But because there's such a variety of different approaches here, then it's really your own what works for you. And like I said at the beginning, if you're stuck on this, if you're like, I really don't know what I should be putting in here, then reach out and I'm happy to like troubleshoot through that and give some ideas. Okay, so finally we get to conclusions, and this is where we broaden back out again in our hourglass shape. So you've gotten really specific and granular, like this is what I learned from my research, and now you're going to broaden it back out to Tolkien studies again. So conclusions are really hard, or at least for me they are. If they're not for you, awesome, please tell me your secrets. I usually give myself at least 3 or 4 days to write a conclusion. I usually rewrite my conclusion multiple times. I angst over it and think about it constantly until it's done. That's my own writing method. So if you're finding conclusions are hard, then yeah, they are. Some possible approaches that can help you wrap your brain around how to tie this really specific work that you've now presented back into the broader field of Tolkien studies. So how does it change the status quo? What is new? What is different? What did you learn that you have not seen anywhere else before? Like, what are you offering the field right now? If that seems like a really high bar to grasp, totally fair. That's a pretty challenging one to start off with. How are you building on existing ideas? That is totally a legitimate approach to take, right? Scholarship is constantly building on and expanding on scholarship. So I've done a lot of work now on death scenes in the Quenta Silmarillion. I am building on um, work that preceded me that was largely focused, almost entirely focused on Lord of the Rings. So in my conclusion, I can talk about how my work on the Silmarillion has expanded beyond the Lord of the Rings, what I've learned new. It doesn't have to be, I'm not getting into groundbreaking territory there if that feels intimidating. I'm just talking about how I'm expanding it. What new directions are suggested from your work? What questions were raised that you didn't get a chance to answer or that you're in the process of answering? You can talk about new directions. And then what should your audience do with this knowledge? And by this, I don't mean that you're like pitching them to go out and buy a book or anything like that, but just how should they view or read the text differently based on what you've learned and what you're presenting. So a lot of like again to draw on my own as an example, like a lot of my research on reading the Silmarillion as history and historical bias. I'm specifically asking people to, at the end, take this idea in mind when they're reading the Silmarillion and interpret it accordingly. So what are they doing with the knowledge that I've given them? Your conclusion is your mic drop moment. So you're going to save your strongest writing and you're going to save your strongest speaking for here. So this is the moment in the film where, you get the swelling dramatic music and, it's the equivalent of that in your presentation. So you definitely want to make sure that you have, here comes that word again, enough time to get through your conclusion in a way that you're not speaking super fast because you want to get through it and you have to, and you're cutting stuff out and you're fumbling over your words because you only have 30 seconds to get this out. You want to make sure that you're building in enough time that you can really spend on this conclusion. Slow yourself down, emphasize the big ideas that are here and give it the attention that it's due, because this is really this is the part that's going to wrap it up. And like I always tell my students, our human brains remember the last thing that we heard better than we tend to hear the stuff that's in the middle. So you want to make sure that you're leaving your audience with something that is powerful, as much as you can. No pressure. So conclusions are worth the time that you spend on them in your presentation, and the time you spend writing them is kind of the TLDR there. Okay, so now you have a paper. So how do you put together a presentation based on this paper? So first of all, there's a couple different ways you can present based on once you have a paper written. So the first, and this is the most common one that people use, is you can just read right off the paper. 95% of people that present at Tolkien conferences, in my experience, this is the approach that they take. And this is definitely, if you're not a comfortable public speaker, this is definitely totally acceptable and probably, if I were to give my advice, the way to go. So this can be done with or without visuals. However, if you choose to just read your paper without visuals, accept that you're going to lose audience members on this who don't have necessarily strong auditory processing skills. So your presentation is going to help focus their attention while you're reading your paper. And your visuals are going to help with that and are going to reinforce what you're saying out loud. There are people who read without visuals. I'm somebody who does not have strong auditory processing. I always say it's the stereotypical professor in the tweed coat who sits up and gets himself comfortable the behind the lectern, sits his paper down and just starts reading without ever looking up once, without ever varying tone of voice. That person, when I see that is about to happen, I'm like, well, this is 20 minutes where I'm going to be able to try and my brain is going to work really hard for about 3 minutes. And then I'm going to get exhausted and I'm just going to kind of stare into space. So people like me are the ones that will get lost on that. It is possible if you're a really engaging presenter. We just heard one last week at Tolkien at UVM who read off of a paper without visuals, and I was with her for the full 20 minutes because she was a very engaging presenter. So it is possible to do, but again, it's know thyself as a presenter. And if you're not super confident in your ability to be engaging, then definitely make sure you have visuals if this is the approach that you're taking. The second approach is to be extemporaneous in your presentation. And so you're just using notes, which may be the little embedded notes in PowerPoint or Google Slides. It may be note cards. It may be, just a piece of paper that you've scribbled some stuff down on. This is, if you're a confident presenter and you're a confident public speaker, this is a super fun way to present. It's like how I'm doing it right now. It's what I do every day in my teaching job. It's really fun because, it allows you to respond and engage a lot more with your audience. And so if you see that people are like really into one part, then you can, talk about that more. If you see you're losing interest, you can move on. When you're reading off of a paper, you're much more locked in. So this is a really fun way to do it, but it can be too fun if you're someone who likes public speaking, and it can be really easy to get caught up in the moment and lose track of time. So my recommendation, if you're going to do this, is to make sure that you have a really visible timer, set an alarm on your phone, so that, you're getting signaled when you're running out of time, or have time blocks for each in your notes. Say, I'm going to spend 2 minutes talking about this, and make sure that you're watching your time so that you don't get caught in the moment and then end up where you have the moderator signaling 2 minutes left and you're like, oh crap, I'm only halfway through my paper. And I still have Now I'm trying to squish everything into 2 minutes. For this stuff, if you choose this one, definitely consider your skills as a public speaker. So most people use, it's a very common thing to have the like, the verbal fillers. Those are like your brain pressing the pause button so that your thoughts can catch up with your speech. And that's fine. That's how people speak. That's a really normal way to speak. But 20 minutes of listening to somebody who says every 3 words is very wearing on your audience. So if you're somebody who really struggles with that, there are ways to work on it and get better, but that may not be the approach that you want to use. Okay, so now as for designing, actually designing a presentation, there's going to be 3 main components. Having a title on your slide that gives kind of an overview of your topic there. That is going to help orient people like me who are struggling to listen along. It's going to help people who maybe aren't native English speakers, who are missing some of the words that you're saying. It's going to bring us into the topic that you're talking about and kind of set the stage. It's called a cognitive schema. It's like activating um, your knowledge on something, and it'll be easier to connect to what you're saying. So there is like brain science behind this. You're getting teacher dawn right now. So a good strong title that talks about that, like clearly states, the topic that you're in right then, will help people follow along. Your main points, really succinct, often as bullet points as a result, will also help people to follow along. And then finally, some sort of image that ties in with the topic of the slide. All of those things are going to activate people to be like, oh, she's talking about basic slide design right now. So if her accent is hard for me to understand, or if I'm not a native speaker and I'm not 100% clear on some of the words that she's using, or I just have trouble following along because maybe I am hard of hearing, or maybe I have auditory processing problems, I'm going to be able to follow along a lot more easily. Um, so when you're designing your slides, first of all, clearly credit artists whose work you use. This is probably not anything that is unfamiliar to anyone that's here, since we're coming from the fan work side of the Tolkien fandom. But and I'm seeing Tolkien scholars doing a lot better with this lately. There's still some, however, who do not, they will put all this beautiful artwork on their slideshow and they do not credit a single artist in it. Obviously, that's not acceptable, right? Sometimes I know the artist that they're using their work, and I know that that person is not cool with their work being used without attribution. So credit should be extremely clear on the slide it's on. If you want to put a note at the end as well so that people can go back and look that up, that's cool too, but it should definitely be on the slide for where the art is being used. Um, I just want to I want to encourage everyone to just look at this slide and think about your first general reaction to it. So don't overcrowd your slides. Possibly you looked at this and you went, nope, like I'm not reading any of that. Or you're so busy trying to read the Maya Angelou quote that I put in there, or the Linwood Press design, elements of design infographic that I put in there, that you're now not even listening to what I'm saying. Very few people can balance doing both. So you don't want to have too much extraneous information, too much information that's not tying back into what you're saying, and you definitely don't want to squish it all into one slide. So don't overcrowd your slides. Likely, don't underfill them either. There can definitely be an advantage to just having like one really powerful, strong point in an otherwise empty slide. But as a general rule, then you want to make sure you don't have too much white space hanging out there, just because it's just not a good use of space. So 3 design reminders there. Clearly credit artist. Don't squish too much together into one slide, and be careful not to include too much information other than what you're talking about in your presentation, because you'll get the people who are so busy reading your slide that they're not listening to what you're saying. That would be me. Um, but then also make good use of your space by not underfilling. Okay, so accessibility. So I'm using the concept of universal design here, which is something that as a teacher I use frequently in my job. Universal design, which in teaching is called universal design for learning, does not stem from, well, it aims to make an environment or an entity as accessible to as many people as possible. And the way that it does this is it does not create something and then add accommodations on for people with disabilities. So it's not adding on extras like, okay, I designed a presentation and now I'm going to think about people who are low vision. Now I'm going to think about people who are hard of hearing. It builds all of that into the core presentation. And the benefit that this has is, of course, you make your presentation accessible to more people, including people with disabilities, which is obviously important for reasons that I don't need to enumerate. However, the extra benefit of this is that people who do not have disabilities will also take a lot more out of your presentation than they would if you're not designing for universal design. The reason for that is, like I've used myself as an example for a few times now, is that people have varying strengths and varying weaknesses that don't necessarily approach the level of disability. So for me, my hearing is not good and my auditory processing is not good. Neither of these would be a disability. I would not qualify for an accommodation under the law in the United States where I live, but it does get in the way of me fully taking in presentation. So if I have a universally designed presentation, then I'm going to follow along a lot better because that presentation is designed knowing that not everyone is going to take in a lot of information really well through auditory processing. So you're going to bring me along just as readily as you're going to bring along perhaps somebody who's hard of hearing, who's also going to benefit from the same things. So first and foremost, internationality. Tolkien fandom and Tolkien scholarship is a really international community, which I don't need to tell anyone here because we're all from different countries right here, right now. So your audience is going to include people who have different comfort levels with English, and even among fluent, even if not first language English speakers, are going to work with different dialects and accents. So that right there is a baseline um, for for considering accessibility. Everybody's going to pronounce Tolkien's names differently. Even if you're talking about people who come from the, exact same flavor of English, everyone's going to pronounce those names differently. And if you add on dialect and accent and varying levels of comfort with English, then it's going to get tricky when all those different pronunciations are floating around out there to know what you're talking about. So my recommendation is to definitely spell out, include in your presentation, Tolkien names that you're using. I would also use this as a moment, and I'll get more into this in the third session, but if you're nervous about your pronunciation of Tolkien's names, don't be. Because my very first Tolkien conference, which was Mythmoot 2, that I presented at, I was so terrified of mispronouncing things because I thought everyone was going to be like, oh, she's clearly a beginner. She clearly doesn't know because she just said Ainulindale weird. So I like meticulously looked up like every single name and practiced pronouncing it over and over and over again. And then I got there, and within the first half hour, I heard people say the word Sauron like three different ways. So people will pronounce things really differently. And so that should be encouraging, that you don't have to worry about how you pronounce all of the different names if you put the emphasis on different syllables, like Glorfindel versus Glorfindel. That's fine. Everyone's going to know who you're talking about, but just especially put that name up in the presentation so that someone who's already maybe having a hard time following along with dialect, accent, or English is seeing that name and like, oh, that's who they're talking about. I mean, same thing, specialized terms definitely should be included in the presentation as well, because that's something that's going to be harder for someone who's not in your field and who is not as comfortable with the flavor of English that you're speaking. It's going to be harder for them to follow along if that term isn't spelled out there. They're going to be like, oh, okay, now I know. Now I have a better sense of what this person is saying because I'm seeing it spelled out. So then thinking about visuals and thinking about how to make your visuals more accessible. So first of all, color blindness. When you're styling your text, don't rely only on color. So on my slide here, I have three ways to represent, for example, a link on a web page. And the first one, I'm just using color. I'm going to lose somebody who has red-green color blindness on that. They're not going to see that that is a link because it's going to blend in with the rest of the text. So on my bottom two examples that are done better, they're more accessible, then I've added text styling on the second one, underline and bold. So that's going to say, oh, a person who can't see the red text is going to say, oh, well, I know it's different because she underlined it and she made it bold. Or you can add graphic elements. So you can add like the little icons and stuff like that that show that that is that's a different, that you want to draw that person's attention to that text is something that's different. So I've added that little link icon in there. Graphs and charts. So to continue with red-green color blindness, because it's pretty familiar and it's much more common, this chart that I've put up here looks like this to somebody with red-green color blindness. So you can see that if this is the chart that you're putting up there and you have someone in your audience with red-green color blindness, they are not going to be able to tell what you were talking about. You're going to lose them immediately on this slide. So when you're using graphs and charts or anything like that, it helps to vary the brightness, not just the shade of color. So what I've done here is I just went in for the bars that were red, and I varied the brightness and made them pink instead. And kept that really bold green in there. It also helps to add patterns. So I also added the little dots on top of the pink bars, and then adding labels in there as well. And I'm going to put a link. I will have a link on a slide that's coming up to a website called Audio Eye, which offers a lot of free accessibility testing tools. They have a feature on their website where you can see things in grayscale. So you can put something in like Photoshop or something like that and grayscale it, and there's various ways to do that. But that website also has something if you want to plug in like a whole slide or something like that, it will render it in grayscale for you. And testing something in grayscale will let you see how someone with color blindness would see it. So here is the same graph in grayscale, and it is much more accessible. Someone who is seeing it in this way can clearly follow along and can see who the hobbits are and who the dragons are in my graph here, because I've added in 3 different features to help them follow along with me. So now instead of losing that person, then um, that audience member is with me. And building on that concept of universal design, I've added that into my chart here in color. People who are not colorblind are going to benefit from this as well. They're certainly not going to lose out on anything. So it's not like, I need to completely change what I'm doing because I'm accommodating people with color blindness. I'm just adding additional features that are going to help all of my audience members, whether they're colorblind or not. So low vision is going to be helped by really good contrast. So Audio Eye, the website I mentioned earlier, provides a free contrast checker. If you want to play around with it, then that's the QR code that's there. The link is also on the SWG article. And they have a number of accessibility tools in addition to this. So something I've noticed, so I've put good examples and bad examples over here. Something I've noticed a lot in presentations lately is that it's really trendy to do the plain white background and then light colored text on top of it. It like looks so sophisticated, right? And it's like the style right now. It's we're getting out of, I think, the beige kick, but gray is really popular and all. I'm gonna avoid making any commentary on that, but as someone who likes color. But you can see that the contrast there for someone with low vision, they're going to be lost on this. And again, thinking about universal design, it's not just people with low vision. Somebody who just, their eyesight is not particularly strong. They don't have a disability. Maybe they don't even wear glasses. They have perfectly fine vision, but they're sitting at the back of the room and they're going to be less able to follow along with that because of it. And so I've given a few examples there, the bright on bright and then the dark on dark. All of those are poor contrast, but sometimes it's surprising what is good contrast versus bad contrast. So I definitely recommend plugging it into a contrast checker like on Audio Eye and giving it a try before committing to a particular layout on a slide. And yes, I did run this slideshow through Audio Eye to make sure that all of my contrasts were good. And I put the horrible ones here through and they failed on all points. So did a lot of playing around in Audio Eye yesterday. So for low vision, sans serif fonts are going to work better for people in digital formats. Serif fonts, oddly enough, work better on paper, but serifs are the little platforms and feet that are on letters. So the example here is sans serif. This is going to be easiest to follow along with for someone with low vision, and then you're also going to bring along people who are just maybe getting exhausted by having to process through their vision the visuals on your screen. They're going to have an easier time with this as well. Universal design. These are the serifs. So that's the little feet and the little platforms on the letters. Decorative samples, again, or decorative fonts. Again, I just want you to take this in and kind of immediately just think about your reaction to it. Do you want to read this? I certainly don't. My reaction to this is nope, not reading it. And I have really, really good, I'm like Fingon descrying, my through the clouds of dust during the Nirnitharnodia level vision. It's like insanely good. And I don't want to read that. So minimize use of decorative and handwriting fonts if you use them at all. They can be used in things like titles, but even then, remembering that titles provide valuable information that helps people follow along, that is not information that you necessarily want people to nope out of. So use them minimally, if at all. Again, for low vision, avoiding clutter and things squished together without white space. So this is my horrible version of this that like makes my skin crawl. This one is much more easy to follow along with. So this is like sigh of relief because I added in some padding there and it's less cluttered. Things aren't like pushing right up against their neighbors. All right, so I thought about being cruel and putting a repeating GIF or animation in here, but I decided not to. I decided to follow my own precepts here. So for people who have attentional problems, which may rise to the level of ADD, ADHD, may not, right? It may just be the people like me who are like squirrel, right? I do not have ADD, but I recently sat through a presentation that had a repeating GIF where it got to the point after I had been looking at it for about 30 seconds and I was like, I cannot look at the screen anymore. You don't want people looking away from your presentation. So even somebody like me who does not have a disability, was lost on that slide because the GIF started to get on my nerves so badly that I just could not look at it anymore. It's going to be a distraction. It's going to be, it's going to take away from your message. So if you do want to have a little animation in there that's cute, don't have it on that constant fast repeat. Have it repeat once or maybe occasionally, or let it repeat for a little while till your audience gets the point for like maybe 15 seconds and then have a slide where it's a still and move on to that. Okay, so now as far as auditory processing. So we did vision, we did attention, internationality. So thinking about people who are having trouble taking in the words that you're saying, and whether that's they're having trouble getting those words into their ears because there's a hearing disability of some kind, or they're having trouble processing those words in their brain. So there's like an auditory processing issue of some sort. These are the design strategies that are going to help those folks follow along better because you're talking at them for 15 minutes in Merith, right? So what's going to help somebody who has trouble hearing or has trouble with auditory processing follow along with a 15-minute spoken presentation? So capturing the big ideas in the text of your presentation is key. That's a really big idea there. I've tried to do it as much here, so hopefully I'm modeling it and hopefully I'm doing a good job of that. Because again, you're activating those cognitive schema, those like places that idea and the big idea in someone's brain that they're then going to be able to attach other information to more readily when you're including those big ideas, and they're then going to be able to pick up on the details much more readily than if they're trying to pull the big ideas out of your speech. If they're struggling to do that, they're not going to be able to get it, not going to be getting the details. If you have the ability to enable closed captioning like I did today, then you can. And that will let people get, switch on their closed captioning and they can get your words right on the screen there. I will say that we did a couple of SWG Merith volunteers did a closed captioning test on Zoom like a week or two ago, and Tolkien names do not render very well. So again, making sure those names are in your presentation, but at least people are getting the bulk of your words and they're hopefully able to fill in the blanks for those names. And then what is really helpful, I find, and I try to do this as much as possible when I'm presenting virtually, is putting a link to um, the full text of the paper somewhere or putting a QR code in the presentation. So people can just follow along, especially if you're reading verbatim off of a paper. People can pull your paper up and they can read it right along with you. As someone who is not strong in auditory processing, I love, love, love when people do this because I will follow along with you for your full paper instead of getting exhausted halfway through and losing attention. So some ways that people can access your paper, you can make it temporarily public on something like Google Drive or Dropbox. And then, when your presentation's over, you can remove those permissions. You can publish it on something like the SWG, or another website that, allows Meta, Tumblr, wherever you want to put it, AO3. The only thing to consider there is that if you're hoping to publish it or you're hoping that it takes on a life beyond this presentation, that you have the ability to pull that public access back pretty quickly. Because a lot of times when you publish something, then they're looking for first rights. So if it's already published on the internet, then you have already exhausted those first rights. So you do want to think about that. But if you're like, I'm not interested in publishing, this is a one-off, then throw it on the SWG, throw it on Tumblr, throw it on AO3, wherever you'd like to post it, and then just drop a link into your presentation, create a QR code, and people can read along with it there. Using a handout, that's very old school, and it's very like my Miss WT teacher mode. But handouts are great, especially if you have charts and graphs that you're going to be putting on the screen that people maybe will have trouble seeing the details on. Or if you're going to be using lengthy quotes or passages that are going to be too big to put on the screen, then you can put those things into a handout, and you can either physically pass it out if it's an in-person event, or you can just link to your handout in the same way that you would link to your paper or presentation, with a QR code or a shortened URL, or the full URL if it's virtual, and you can just dump it in the chat. So, okay, so to wrap up, and this is more getting into more advanced strategies, but if you want to make your presentation interactive, if you want to engage your audience beyond them just listening, I wanted to throw some tools in there that I've used as a teacher, and then a few I haven't, but I found in researching for this that I want to just make people aware of. So everything in here is free, or at least has a free level. I think all of them have a paid level, but you can get some basic features that you can use in a presentation to add some interactive elements. Some caveats that I will put in there. First and foremost, use this with care, especially as a first-time presenter. You're adding an extra layer of complexity on there. And of course, especially if you're presenting virtually, then anytime you're interacting multiple things with Zoom or Google Meets or Microsoft Teams, then there's more failure points there. So you want to make sure you understand any of the tools that you're using really, really well, that you try them out ahead of time, and preferably in the platform you'll be presenting in if it's a virtual presentation. So get really comfortable with them and how they work ahead of time, because on the day of the presentation, like, that is just going to add an extra level of stress. Also think about, I haven't said the word in a while, but time. So these things can be fun, but they also eat up time. So if you're looking at 15 minutes for Marathon Airthed, and you spend 5 of them doing a quiz game at the beginning, that will really engage your audience, perhaps, but then you only have 10 minutes to present. So it's always that balance, your trade-off between audience engagement and then paying more attention to your presentation versus having less time to present in. So first and foremost are survey and poll tools. These can be nice to put up just at the beginning to kind of, ask a question that, a controversial question like, was Feanor a bad guy in in the Silmarillion, just to throw one out there, because I've put some examples of mentees that I have created for my students on there. But this can get the audience immediately in the frame of mind, can get them thinking about some of the questions that you will raise in your presentation, can be a good kickoff to jump off for your discussion. So Menti is one tool that does that, and it will visualize your responses as graphs or word clouds, which is really nice because it's a very pretty display. As you can see, I've included 3 different mentees that I've created for my students for my classes that I teach as a teacher. Off to the right there. Poll Everywhere is another one. This one, the responses come through in a very different format. They come through just as the raw text that the person puts in. So I've did an example that I just kind of did off the cuff there with some names of characters. The word count limit for Poll Everywhere is really, really long. So I have students who write like little paragraphs when we use Poll Everywhere. They'll just be back there, like just frantically typing in during the discussion for like 10 minutes. And I'm like, are you done yet? Like, are you ever going to hit enter? Hold on, hold on, hold on. I just need 30 more seconds. And then, and then it's like this big old paragraph comes through. So, it can be more in depth than Menti is, but it also will pop up one at a time. So it's going to take more time, whereas Menti is just that quick snapshot. Your audience will access these through a link or a QR code that you will display at the beginning, and they'll just immediately, be taken to the response where they'll put in their response really quickly. So they're really quick and easy to launch, assuming that the technology plays well. They don't need too much time to launch. Zoom, Google Meets, and Microsoft Teams all have poll tools built in, but this is for virtual only presentations. So if you're in a hybrid model or you're an in-person, then obviously this isn't going to work. You're not going to get your in-person people here. But if you're in a virtual only, kind of like I am right now, then you can use these as well, just to get that kind of like quick audience engagement, or even just to like take a temperature check of where your audience is on a particular topic, which can, maybe if you're doing an extemporaneous presentation, will shape how you present. All right, games and quizzes can be super fun. Um, Kahoot is my recommended one that I use all of the time. Oh my goodness, my students like melt down with glee when they come in and they see my start slide up on the screen. Go to kahoot.it. They're just like, oh, we're doing a Kahoot. It's really, really fun. So it's at the free level, it's multiple choice questions with up to 4 choices. And, again, you'll get a start screen that people will put in a code or they'll scan a QR, and, they'll be able to respond right on their phone or their device. And, there's a leaderboard after each question, and then there's a podium at the end. So it can be fun. This one is more time consuming, but it can be yet again another way to engage audiences, get people thinking about questions. There is a poll that's available through Kahoot, but it's paid level only. And I have a paid Kahoot account through my school, and even I don't have access to that. So it is something like $15 a month or something to get access to that. So probably not worth it for a single presentation. And then off to the right there is kind of what the interface looks like. So the top one is what it looks like as a presenter. So how you will see your quiz in there. Um, the screen that users, participants will see when they're joining, and then what they will see on their phone once they have joined. So interactive slides, I have not used these. So I found them. They have free levels, and they have some really cool sounding features that are available for free. I have not used them, so I can't speak to them from personal experience. Slido has the ability to integrate with pretty much every like major presentation platform, and it allows you to add in to your presentation polls, audience Q and A's, and quizzes. Again, I have not used it, so, use it with care. I can't speak to how well it works. Play around with it first before committing to it. And another one is Genially. This one is a presentation platform, so it doesn't integrate. So like if you've created your slideshow in PowerPoint, you're not going to be able to integrate this into that the way you can with Slido. You would have to create your presentation in here. But again, it allows you to add games and quizzes into your presentation for that interactive element. This is also not one that I've used. So if you want to give it a try, make sure that you build in plenty of opportunity for testing. And that brings me to the end. There's the QR code for all of the stuff, all the links that I've provided here, all the different tools, and the AudioEye accessibility checkers. And at least as far as the people that I saw had joined by the time I started, I know you all know about our newsletter, Tumblr, and Dreamwith, but if anyone has joined since and doesn't, then those are up there. And that's a good way to follow to find out when the third installment is coming up and other additional information about Meredith Earthad.